Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, whenever it might happen to be for you today again, folks. Welcome back. Yes, we are here again with another short story time. As I said, we will be getting back into the game, just giving everybody a bit of time to get themselves and everything they need to do sorted out. Today, though, I've got one that I'm kind of excited about telling myself. As a dungeon master, as a DM, there are always going to be some NPCs that you create for the game that never get fully explored. You never really get to use them properly. And for the Olyndar campaign that I ran, I think it was either the first or second campaign, so we're looking at either 10 years ago or 7 years ago, I created a group of NPCs called the Bad Company. And I introduced them in the game. They came up a few times, but it never really got to go anywhere. The players went in a different direction, the story veered off, and they became less relevant. They faded into the background and kind of gotten forgotten about. So I never got to explore those guys the way I wanted to. So today, I've got a story for you that is all about the Bad Company, and is a little insight into these characters that I created, that I loved, and that I never really got to use properly. Will they come up again in a future game? Who knows? We'll see. But for now, you guys have this, so enjoy. The frontier town of Driftstone sat at the edge of the civilized world, a place where the rules of morality bent under the weight of necessity. It was here, in a smoky saloon lit by flickering lanterns, that Bad Company found themselves staring down the barrel of a morally fraught decision. Their prospective employer, a greasy merchant named Thaddeus Crane, had offered them a job that would pay more than any of them had seen in years. A small fortune in gold to hunt down and destroy a settlement of outlaws camped deep in the hills. According to Crane, the outlaws had been raiding supply caravans and terrorizing nearby towns. But as the job's details unfolded, the group discovered a troubling truth. This was no gang of hardened criminals. The so-called outlaws were desperate refugees, farmers and families who had fled indentured servitude under Crane's rule, business practices, and taken to banditry to survive. Seated around a corner table in the dimly lit saloon, the group of four debated the job with the intensity of a battlefield strategy meeting. The murmur of drunken laughter and the clink of glasses from other patrons faded into the background as their voices rose in hushed but heated tones. "Gold's gold," said Pyro, swirling her drink lazily as she leaned back in her chair, boots propped against the edge of the table. Her fiery hair was tied back, but a few rebellious strands framed her sharp features, illuminated by the faint glow of the lantern overhead. She exuded an air of practiced indifference, but there was a tightness in her jaw that betrayed her unease. "We're not here to be heroes. We take the job, we get paid, and we move on. Simple as that." "Simple?" barked Squint, his tone dripping with disbelief. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his weathered face lined with frustration. His eyes, sharp and calculating, glinted in the low light as they bore into Pyro. "We'd be slaughtering families, Pyro. Not bandits, not hardened killers, families." "You good with killing women and kids for a payday?" Pyro shrugged, her eyes darting away from Squint's piercing gaze. "They're raiders," she said, her voice quieter but still firm. "If we don't do it, someone else will. And let's be real, Squint. Someone else won't hesitate to leave a pile of bodies behind. At least we can make it clean." Squint's fists clenched, and for a moment it looked like he might stand up and leave. "Clean," he muttered under his breath, his tone venomous. "There's nothing clean about this job." The tension between them was thick, threatening to suffocate the air. It was Spark who broke it, his calm, measured voice cutting through the argument. "What if we take the job?" he began, tapping his mechanical gauntlet rhythmically against the wooden table. "But go in soft. We scare 'em off. Make it look like we cleared the camp and leave the families alive. We get the gold and avoid the guilt. Everybody wins." The gauntlet's soft clinks punctuated his words, a constant reminder of Spark's pragmatic approach to life. His eyes scanned the group, searching for signs of agreement. "That's naive," said William Book's writer, his voice calm but laced with an edge of weariness. He sat straight-backed in his chair, one hand resting lightly on the worn leather cover of the notebook that rarely left his side. His other hand cradled a glass of whiskey that had long since gone untouched. "If we don't deal with them properly, Crane will hire someone else, someone worse. And if we don't take the job, the next crew might do more than kill them. They might burn the whole camp to the ground. Is that what you want, Spark? To leave them at the mercy of someone like Crane?" Spark opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated, unable to meet Book's steady gaze. Book sighed, the weight of the conversation evident in the way his shoulders slumped. "But," he continued, his voice softening, "we can't just wipe them out either. That's not who we are, or who I want us to be." His eyes swept across the group, lingering on each of them in turn. "We're better than that." "So what then?" Pyro snapped, her voice rising as she slammed her boots down from the table. "We just sit here and starve while we wait for the perfect job to fall into our laps?" "Newsflash, Books. Jobs like that don't exist out here. You think the frontier cares about our morals? It doesn't, and neither does our empty purse." Book shook his head, his expression unreadable. "We do this one," he said after a long pause. His voice was steady, but there was a hint of resignation in it. "But we do it our way. No unnecessary bloodshed, no collateral damage. We'll dismantle their operation, scare them off, and make sure they can't come back. And after this—" He paused, taking a deep breath as if to steel himself for the words that followed. "After this, we never take a job like this again. Agreed?" The table fell silent. Squint was the first to nod, though the anger hadn't fully left his face. "Fine," he muttered. "But if things go sideways, I'm not going to be the one who pulls the trigger on a kid. You all better remember that." Spark gave a small shrug, his mechanical gauntlet clicking softly as he adjusted a loose bolt. "If we're going to do it, I say we do it smart. No reason to let things get messy." Pyro hesitated, her fiery demeanor dimming as she stared down into her drink. "We'll do it," she said finally, her voice softer than before. "But don't blame me if this all goes to hell." Books raised his glass, though there was no celebratory glint in his eye. "To us," he said quietly. "Let's just hope we're still us when this is over." Reluctantly, the others raised their glasses, each burdened by the weight of the decision. For better or worse, they were in this together. The camp lay nestled in a narrow valley, its crude shelters of patched canvas and scavenged wood blending into the rocky outcroppings that surrounded it. Smoke from small cooking fires spiraled into the night sky, mingling with the faint glow of distant stars. The air was still, heavy with the mingled scents of unwashed bodies, damp earth, and the faint metallic tang of desperation. The four approached under the cover of darkness, moving with practiced precision. Pyro took the lead, her fiery hair tucked under a dark hood to avoid giving away their position. Spark followed closely, his mechanical gauntlet whirring softly as he scanned the area with a modified scope. Squint brought up the rear, his rifle cradled in his arms, eyes darting to every shadow. Books, ever the quiet observer, moved in the middle, his hand resting on the hilt of a well-worn pistol. The camp wasn't defenseless. Makeshift alarms, tripwires strung with tin cans and crude bells, had been set up around the perimeter. Spark knelt by one, carefully disarming it with a small pair of pliers. The others watched his back, tense and alert. "This place is more fortified than I expected," Spark murmured, his voice barely audible. "They're scared," Books replied quietly. "Desperation makes people resourceful." The plan was simple in theory. Sneak in, dismantle their weapons and supplies to force them to move on, scatter the able-bodied men who had taken up banditry and avoid harming the families. It was a compromise, enough to fulfill their contract while keeping their moral code intact. But as they moved deeper into the camp, the unease in Book's gut grew. Plans, especially out here on the frontier, rarely survived first contact. A sentry spotted them. The young man's shout cut through the night like a knife, and chaos erupted. Refugees spilled out of their shelters, some grabbing makeshift weapons, rusted blades, clubs fashioned from broken chair legs, even rocks. Women pulled children close, their eyes wide with fear. From one of the larger tents, a small group of hardened bandits emerged, their expressions dark with fury. "Damn it!" Pyro hissed, raising her hands. Flames danced at her fingertips, casting flickering light across her face. So much for subtle. One of the bandits, a burly man with a jagged scar running down his cheek, let out a guttural roar and charged. Others followed, emboldened by his example. "Hold your fire!" Squint barked, raising his rifle to his shoulder. His sharp eyes tracked the bandits' movements with precision. "We're not here to kill you." "Stand down!" His warning went unheeded. The bandits, driven by fear and desperation, surged forward. Pyro held her ground, thrusting her hands outward and conjuring a wall of fire. The flames roared to life, cutting off the attackers and forcing them to skid to a halt. "This was supposed to be easy!" Pyro shouted, frustration evident in her voice. She hurled a firebolt into the dirt near an advancing bandit, the explosion of heat and light sending him scrambling backward. Meanwhile, Spark ducked low, pulling a small metallic orb from his belt. He twisted the top, and the device hissed before releasing a thick cloud of smoke. The acrid fog spread quickly, disorienting the bandits and giving the group a momentary advantage. In the confusion, Books found himself face to face with a boy, barely more than 16, holding a rusted sword that trembled in his grip. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken from hunger, but there was a fire in them that spoke of defiance. "Don't do this," Books said, his voice steady but soft. He raised his hands, palms out, to show he wasn't reaching for his weapon. "You don't have to fight us. We're not your enemy." The boy hesitated, his knuckles white as he gripped the hilt of his sword. For a moment it seemed he might lower it, but then a sharp crack echoed through the night as Squint fired a warning shot into the air. The sound startled the boy, and he lunged forward, his blade arcing toward Books. Reacting on instinct, Books sidestepped the attack and swung the butt of his pistol. The blow connected with the side of the boy's head, and he crumpled to the ground unconscious. Books stood over him, chest heaving, his hands shaking. Behind him the chaos continued. Pyro maintained her wall of fire, her face a mask of grim determination. Squint fired another warning shot, his voice booming as he ordered the remaining bandits to stand down. Spark moved like a shadow through the smoke, dismantling a pile of weapons he had found near one of the larger tents. The camp was in disarray, the fight quickly devolving into panic. Women screamed, clutching their children as they fled into the surrounding hills. The remaining bandits, seeing their cause lost, dropped their weapons and ran. As the smoke cleared and the flames died down, the four regrouped near the center of the camp. The bodies of discarded weapons lay scattered around them, but there were no corpses, only the unconscious or the terrified. Pyro broke the silence, her voice strained. "Tell me that was worth it." Books looked down at the boy he had knocked out, his expression heavy with guilt. "I don't know," he admitted. "But at least no one died tonight." Squint snorted, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. Not for lack of trying on their part. Spark adjusted his gauntlet, the faint hum of its mechanisms filling the quiet. "We did what we could. Let's get out of here before Crane sends someone to check on his investment." Books nodded, but as they turned to leave, his voice cut through the dark. "We'll take the gold," he said, "but this is the last time we do something like this." Pyro looked at him, her fiery demeanor subdued. "And if the next job's worse?" Book's gaze was hard, unwavering. "Then we walk away. I'd rather starve than lose who we are." The others exchanged glances, each silently grappling with the weight of the night's events. Finally they nodded in agreement, the unspoken vow settling heavily over them. As they disappeared into the night, the camp behind them was left in silence, a silence that was both a relief and a reminder of the fine line they walked as guns for hire on the unforgiving frontier. By the end of the night the camp was in ruins. The bandits had been scattered, their makeshift armory destroyed. Most of the refugees, terrified and broken, had fled into the wilderness with what little they could carry. But the group couldn't avoid casualties. 2 of the bandits had been killed in the skirmish, and a stray firebolt from Pyro's initial attack had ignited a tent. injuring an elderly woman who had been too slow to escape. When the dust settled, they returned to Crane with the proof he had demanded, a collection of broken weapons and a handful of tokens taken from the bandits. Crane paid them without a second thought, his only concern being whether they'd left any survivors who might return to cause him trouble. Books didn't answer him. Instead, he led the group out of Blackthorn, their pockets heavy with gold, but their spirits weighed down by guilt. That night, around a crackling campfire far from the town, Books broke the silence. "This isn't who we are," he said, his voice firm. "We took the job because we were desperate, but we didn't think about what it would cost. Not just the refugees, but us. We crossed a line tonight. Yeah, well, welcome to the frontier," Pyro muttered, tossing a stick into the fire. But even she looked shaken. "No," Squint said, his tone sharp. "Books is right. If we keep doing jobs like this, we'll be no better than the bastards we're working for." "So what do we do?" Spark asked. "We make a vow," Books said. "From now on we choose our contracts. No jobs that target the helpless, no jobs that force us to do this again. We're not here to be heroes, but we can be better than this." One by one the others nodded, each silently reflecting on the night's events. "Fine," Pyro said at last, a hint of defiance still in her voice. "But if we starve because of your damn morals, I'm eating Squint first." The group chuckled, the tension easing just enough to remind them why they were still together. The job in Driftstone marked a turning point for the bad company. They began to take fewer contracts, choosing their employers carefully and refusing jobs that would compromise their newfound code. Over time, they shed their old name and became the Iron Fang Rangers, a group that still operated in the shadows but carried themselves with a sense of honor and purpose. They weren't perfect, and the frontier remained a place of moral ambiguity. But the vow they made that night set them on a path that would define their legacy for decades to come.